name it is Cote, me boys. Me age is 53. For 25 or 30 years I fished upon the sea. Now it seems a waste of time. Catches they grow small. Foreigners take the bigger fish and throw back all the small. Oh, we're rolling on the sea, me boys. We're rolling on the sea. We'll catch the fish and then we'll bitch. We're rolling on the sea. Well, I hear the politicians, they're crapping on us all, but they've never froze their asses off while pulling up the trawl. Nor ate a soggy sandwich, then lost it overside, then spent 4 hours coming home, rolling on the tide. Oh, we're rolling on the sea, me boys. We're rolling on the sea. Oh, we'll catch the fish and then we'll bitch. We're rolling on the sea. Well, don't misunderstand me now. It's not that bad, you know. I could have been a lumberjack or a miner down below. At least I held a few cold months to mend by nets and traps, to drink the rum and figure how to stiff the income tax. Oh, we're rolling on the sea, me boys. We're rolling on the sea. Oh, we'll catch the fish and then we'll bitch. We're rolling on the sea.
I'm Doug Devine. Welcome to The Last Wooden Lobster Pot, filmed in Woods Harbor on the southwest tip of Nova Scotia. This is my dad, Ken Devine. When these shots were taken, Dad was nearing the end of his fishing career, which spanned more than 50 years. And he's seen a lot of changes. Woods Harbor Wharf keeps looking different from year to year as the industry changes. The boats themselves are loaded with expensive equipment, hydraulic heights, computers, radars, fish finders, GPS systems, autopilots. And the living quarters are much more comfortable than they were when Dad started. Looking at all this now, it's hard to imagine what it was like in the 1950s. Maybe the best way to see what it was like is to view some old home movies. In the late summer, it was sword fishing season. Here the fishermen are unloading the swordfish. Throughout the summer, many fishermen would go hand lining, catch halibut, haddock, cod, pollock, hake. These are herring. This particular catch is not being sold for food. They're putting up salt bait for the lobster season coming up in the fall. They fill bait barrels up, a layer of herring, a layer of salt, a layer of herring, a layer of salt, and so on. The barrels were then sealed and left outdoor for a few months, and when lobster season came, they opened them up again and filled their bait bags. And that stuff on the road, that's Irish moss. The fishermen would use long rakes to rake it off the ocean bottom, and take it ashore and cart it up to the roads, spread it out. There the sun would dry it. It would have to be turned from time to time, and the fishermen's wives and children would help turn the moss. Once the moss was dry, it would be packed in crocus bags and then sold. But by far the most important industry was lobster fishing. This is what the first day of the lobster season used to look like. Fishermen would prepare for months for this. The boats would all have to be painted, maintained, lobster traps built, ropes measured, spliced, buoys painted. There wasn't a lot of comforts in these boats. In the morning, the fishermen would have to light a wooden stove and get that going. They were made of wood, so they leaked, and you'd have to pull on a hand pump for quite a while until you got them bailed out. No radars in those days. Instead of that, you'd have a watch and a compass, and landmarks if you could see them. The first day of lobstering was a spectacular sight to see. All the fully loaded boats would park outside the wharf and wait for a gun to go off to start the season, and they'd all go out to once. It amounted to a race, with the fishermen all trying to establish their position on the lobster grounds. They'd make 3 or 4 trips throughout the day. There was no more distinctive feature of the area than the old lobster pot itself. In the summer, there'd be rows of wooden lobster pots everywhere. The wooden lobster pots built in southwest Nova Scotia were very distinct. They were longer and heavier, so they could be fished in the world's highest tides. American tourists used to stop and ask to buy old lobster pots so they could use them as coffee tables. My memories go back to my grandfather, Robert Devine, who spent his youth fishing on the Grand Banks in a dory. Later, Grandfather got into lobster fishing. Dad and Grandfather went together in the same boat for quite a few years. This is one of Grandfather's boats. Dad married my mother Isabel, and they had 3 children. I was the oldest, my brother Roger, and then my sister Wendy. Here's a picture of me as a baby trying to get in the way as Dad dries his moss on the roads. This was Dad's first new boat, the Duggan Raj, all loaded up to go out the first day of lobster. Dad's next new boat was the Windy Gale, named after my sister Wendy. Then he had the Isabel M, and finally the Ripple. And these are scenes of Dad unloading one of his last loads of pots before he retired from fishing a few years ago. These are the wire traps that they build now. These pots are square. They got aluminum nozzles, cement ballast, plastic escape hatches. They work, but I don't expect any American tourists are going to stop by and pick any of these up for coffee tables. The wooden pot only had about a 4-year lifespan, and with them not building them anymore, it's not long before they're all going to end up here. But what would really be bad is if the knowledge of how they were built was lost along with them. So, our family decided to build one more lobster pot, in the style of the 1950s. Most of the materials you'd need to build a lobster pot back in the 50s was harvested from the woods on the shore. One of the first things you'd need to build one were the 4 bows. I think Dad was out fishing at the time, so my mother and I went over to Ford's Point and we cut a few bows for the pot. In addition to the bows that form the framework of the pot, I also had to cut the nuzzle bows. They get bent into a circle and the lobster crawls through them, entering the pot. Next, the bows will be cut to the right length so that when they're bent, they'll make the right shape for the pot. The next step is to taper the ends so that the ends will fit into the holes in the sills. When I was helping Dad build his pots in the 70s, this was a lot easier because we had this shaper. We'd hook it to a motor and push the bow into the end and it would shape it automatically to the right size. To help the bow spin better, the bark is peeled off the inside of the bend. You'd have to harvest more bows than you were actually going to use because not all of them would bend. Sometimes we'd steam them or soak them in hot water just to get them to bend better, depending on how the bows were bending. Once the bows were limber enough, they'd be bent over the knee and inserted into the sill. To keep them from coming out again, you drive a nail through the sill and into the bows. In order to get a good looking pot, matched sets of bows would be chosen so that the pot would come out straight. We had various varieties of pot building benches. This is just the last one the Dad had. The horizontal support is actually inserted through the bows, and one end gets inserted into the bench and the other end freestands on the floor. One of the most important jobs is to get the bows the right distance from each other. This ensures that the heads and all the other parts of the pot fit properly together because they're built separately. When we were building pots in the 70s, we didn't do it quite this way. We actually built the bottom first, and there was a jig that we could just put the bows in and it was automatically fitted. But this jig is long since gone. Since we're building 1950 style pot, we're doing it the old way anyway, so it was done on these little laths and carefully lined up so that the pot was symmetrical. The final step in lining up the bows was this temporary lath. The nails wouldn't be pounded in all the way. Later it would be removed. They would keep things in place while everything else was being done. Now that the bows are in place, Dad shaves them to make a flat place to nail the laths on the sides. And now, Dad and Raj can nail the first 4 laths to the side. The laths are made of oak. When the industry started, softwood laths were used, but they went with oak because it lasts a lot longer. The spacing in between the laths is important. If the gaps are too wide, market-sized lobsters could get out. If they're too narrow, then the heads and other parts won't fit together right. Notice the nails in between the laths. They don't get pounded in all the way. They'll be used to attach the heads, you'll see later on. If you've seen a pot, then you'll have noticed there's openings on each side, and these are openings where the lobster crawls into the pot. A double lath is used next to the sill, one lath nailed on top of the other. This is one of the laths that you use when you're lifting the pot. Another double lath is required here. The lobster pot is almost symmetrical, so building the other side starts the same way. Each lobster pot has a door. This is opened when you're baiting the pot, when you're removing lobsters, or when you're repairing the pot. The shaped hardwood cleats form the framework for the door itself. There are 3 cleats and they're placed next to the bows, parallel to it so the door opens properly. The hinges of the doors are made of strips of rubber tire. They're nailed perpendicularly across the cleat and the bow. At this point, the temporary lath that was put on just to keep the bows in line can be removed. Two more laths go on to finish the door. They're nailed to the cleats. On top of the middle one now goes a double lath, and that lath makes the pot strong enough to stand on. At this point, the pot wouldn't yet open because the cleats would be too long. The hinges are now squeezed together, and this positions the cleats in the right position to be sawn. The pot will open. With the top of the pot made, now it's time to do the bottom. On the outer edges, two laths would be butted together, and another one would be nailed on top, and this would form a double lath or a skid surface. The laths are actually a little longer than the pot at this stage. Now they get trimmed off with a saw. Now we have the basic framework of the pot built. The door's on there. But if we were to throw this in the water, this would not sink to bottom. This would be a problem. So now we're going to put the ballast rocks in. Going out and finding ballast rock was just another job that we did when we were building pots. And Dad, he's got a splitting axe there. He's going to split the rock. Only certain kinds of rock were good for splitting. The rock has to be shaped until it fits into the pot. The next step is to secure the ballast rock into the pot with laths. These lath nails are driven only halfway, and they're placed on the bows in certain places, and they'll be used to hook the heads later on. Similarly, these nails are only driven halfway, and they're used to hook the heads later on. The nuts in the pots are called the heads. And this piece of wood is called a mesh board. It's the same circumference as a mesh. Each loop in the head is called a mesh. This is a knitting needle. They are made of wood or nylon in this case. And here's how you string a knitting needle. This is a nuzzle bow. The little bendy sticks that we found in the woods are used to make these. This is an old board that we used to use to knit our heads on. The bottom was covered with cloth to keep it from scratching the floor. Here you can see the action of the knitting needle and the mesh board. Initially, the full needle might be hard to push through the meshes, but as the twine came off it, it was smoothing out. The first thing you do is make one long line of meshes. Although you could knit heads with a hook on the wall, you'd have to keep moving your chair back, but with this rig you could push it ahead with your feet and not have to move your chair. Once you had the line of meshes, then you would string your knitting needle through them. You'd keep a small loop of twine on your hook, and this is what you'd do with it. Now you could knit across the loops and make the fat part of the head. All the meshes of one line would fit on the mesh board. You take the mesh board out and start your next line. Once the main part of the head was done, you needed a thinner section, so you started doing less meshes. You continued till that was finished. The final step was to join the small part with the big one to form a loop. As we grew up, we learned to knit heads for ourselves, and sometimes there'd be 3 of us knitting heads in the kitchen. Each pod had 4 heads, 2 side heads, 1 end head, and a bedroom head. The 2 side heads were the same, so there were basically 3 types of heads to knit. Once the heads were knit, they could be strung onto the nozzles, so the next step was to prepare the nozzles. Dad still had his old nozzle bender. The nozzles are cut approximately to the length and then they're stripped on the inside to make them easier to bend. There's a little loop on the bender, you run them around. Now the head can be strung on the nozzle. In latter years, metal nozzles took the place of wooden ones. A special knot has to be tied in the nozzle bow to keep it together. That's one ready to go in the pot. Now for the job of rigging the pot. Dad's drawing a line down the center of a lathe which is going to split. These narrower strips will be used to attach the heads into the pot, as we'll see.
Yeah.
They're being measured against where they're going to fit in the pot, and then cut to size. The side heads are also attached like this, and the pieces are cut to size for them. The sticks that were just cut are now strung through the bottom of the heads. The bedroom head is the largest of the four heads, and it doesn't have a nozzle. It actually fits inside the pot. Once the heads are in position, then the sticks that were strung through them can get nailed down. Remember those little nails that were half pounded in between the laths and on the double laths and on the bows? Well, here's where they come in. Each mesh fits over one of those nails. This is why the pot had to be built to such exacting dimensions. If the pot was in the wrong shape, then it would be hard to fit the heads in. Here Dad's using a little tool to help pull the meshes when they get tight. Once the head's in place, all the nails it was hooked to are bent over. This is the bedroom head being strung on.
Short nail. Where I want to. Short one.
Now that the heads are securely fastened into the pot, they have to be guyed. Dad's cutting guy strings. This is one of the most critical parts of building the pot. An improperly guyed pot won't fish right. The first thing Dad's doing is he's guying the bedroom head. The guy strings on the bedroom head have to be tight, and yet the mouth of the bedroom head has to flop down, sort of fold over so that the lobster can't escape. Now Dad's guying the nozzles of the side heads. The final head to be guyed is the end head. With the end head in place, now a corner has to be knocked off the cleat so it doesn't keep catching in the head. At one point they used to use buttons to close the doors. These were like outhouse door buttons where you could twist them, but the seals figured that out and got the bait, so they had to go to this system that the seals couldn't handle. This lath serves to double reinforce the laths holding down the heavy ballast. On the bedroom end of the pot, we actually close the opening with laths. This is the end of the pot where the rope's going to go that hauls the pot up. To make room for this rope, little notches are placed in this first lath. Each of the laths in turn have to be sawed on angles so that they fit along the bow. Now the sills get trimmed. The pot's almost finished. One of the last jobs is whittling the spindle. The spindle is a spit that holds the bait bags. Back when I was helping build pots, we used spikes for this, but in the 50s they whittled them out of wood. The spindle will be driven into the bottom of the pot through this hole. This spindle's ready for the bait bag. Here's how they were made. A bait bag is basically made out of herring seine, used herring seine. Dad would cut them up into squares and we'd spend the evening stringing them like this. The method Dad used in the latter years involved a piece of rubber tire and this gadget. Put the rubber tire in it, it would punch a hole, and you could string the string back through this little gap and then pull it back through. Remember that salt bait that the fishermen were putting up in the old home movie at the beginning of the film? We'd take a handful of that old stinky salt bait, chuck it in the bait bag, draw it tight, and then it would go on, be tied to the spindle. The last job in building the pot was to put the family mark on it. This was handed down from generation to generation. Our family mark was 2 saw cuts and then a large nail. Now that the pot's built, it has to be bridled. It's the bridle that the buoy line gets attached to so that the pot can be pulled up. The loop Dad's making is what the buoy line will be tied to. Stranding the end of the rope before tying a knot in it ensures that the knot will never come out. So, how does this pot work? How do you turn this into this? The lobster smells the bait and comes to the pot. Of course, the easiest way to get at that bait is through one of the nozzles. Once the lobster is finished eating, he looks for the best way out, and the biggest opening from inside that pot is up through the bedroom head. So the lobster crawls through there. Once he's in the bedroom head, he can never get out. The little flap flaps down, and there's no way for him to get it through there. The basic lobster trap design has been around for 100 years. The new wire traps use exactly the same principle. Now that the lobster trap is completed and bridled, now we have to do the rope work so that it can be hauled to the surface. The rope that is used with lobster pots is actually two different sections, the green and some other color. The green is actually leaded line. It's got one strand with a little bit of lead core, and it sinks. It's used on the top of the line. To join the two together smoothly, you have to splice them. Here, Dad's using a fid, which is a tool used for splicing for hundreds of years. The fid is inserted into the strands of the rope, and then the strand of the other piece is tucked in, so these are called tucks. The green is tucked into the orange, and the orange is tucked into the green. This process continues until there's at least 3 tucks on each side. When all the tucks are in place, a knife is used to cut the strands that are left over. This joint will be tougher than any part of the rope. The rope is now attached to the bridle of the pot. The knot used is one that won't come off the pot, but you can easily take it apart if you have to remove the pot from the line. When not in use, lobster pot lines are always coiled and tied. This is an old wooden swivel, like the ones they used in the 50s. The swivel would allow the buoy to turn in the tide without twisting the line all up into knots. The swivel also has to be removed from time to time, so the same knot that was used on the bridle is used here. Finally, it's time to tie the buoy onto the swivel. The old buoys in the 50s were actually wood. Each fisherman would paint his buoys a different color than the other fishermen so they could be identified on the surface. Dad's colors were orange and white, and he painted a half moon on the end. Oh, there you have it, the whole thing. Throw this over with some bait on it, in the right place, and you can catch lobsters.
So raise a glass and drink a toast to men of days gone by, to the ships that sailed before the days of steam. Raise a glass and drink a toast, throw a log upon the fire, and I'll tell you of the schooner Kathleen. So raise a glass and drink a toast, throw a log upon the fire, and I'll tell you of the schooner